topics that Lawrence covers on that radio show. So thank you very much, Lawrence.
Thanks, Matt. Keep up the great work yourself, sir.
All right, thanks. Next up, we have Jessica Taylor. And Jessica is a research biologist and project coordinator at the Canadian Centre for Evidence-Based Conservation at Carleton University. And Jessica works with Dr. Stephen Cook there. And at the center, she leads the conduct of evidence syntheses, which include systematic reviews and systematic maps for clients and people in Canada, including Environment and Climate Change Canada and Fisheries and Oceans Canada. So very involved with lots of government agencies in Canada, as well as some others in the US, Sweden, UK. So I'm interested to hear Jessica's talk. She's going to be talking today about some of her work with the Canadian Centre for Evidence-Based Conservation and some of how these different forms of evidence syntheses work and how they can be adopted to support decision-making and aquatic management in Canada. So welcome, Jessica. I'm going to share your, thanks. I'm going to share your presentation right now. All right, there you go.
Okay. Just trying to get control of it here. Sorry, should I be able to use the arrows or?
I think you should be able to use the arrows, yeah.
Maybe not.
There you go.
Okay, all right, sorry about that.
There might be a little slight delay. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, so good morning. Oh, I don't know what it's gone now. All right. Good morning. As Matt mentioned, my name is Jessica Taylor. So I'm going to present how we can use evidence synthesis for improved aquatic management in a changing world. So I am a research biologist and evidence synthesis coordinator at the Canadian Centre for Evidence-Based Conservation. We are led by Dr. Stephen Cook, who you just heard from, and we're located in his Fish Ecology and Conservation Physiology lab. Our group is one of 8 global collaboration for environmental evidence centers around the world. And we do conduct evidence syntheses to support evidence-based decision-making in Canada and abroad. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the many partner organizations that we work with, either as commissioners of the syntheses we conduct, or whose staff members sit on one or more of our advisory teams. So just a quick outline of what we'll go through today. So I'll introduce the idea of environmental evidence, the types of evidence synthesis that exist, what we can learn from these evidence syntheses, and how evidence synthesis can inform evidence-based management and decision-making. So before I get started, just a quick history lesson in evidence synthesis. So the concept of systematic reviews originated in the medical field in the 80s, when there was this growing need to synthesize evidence on the many medical interventions being used. So imagine a doctor is trying to treat an illness with an intervention or a drug that they find effective, but across town, across the country, or even across the world, there are other doctors using different treatments that may or may not be more effective. Doctors may have made the decision to use that treatment based on one paper that they found, or maybe on they asked a colleague for advice on what treatment they should use. So in the 80s, the Cochrane collaboration was created to solve this issue, and systematic reviews were introduced to comprehensively and reliably synthesize and present all available evidence on an intervention. In the late 90s, the Campbell collaboration was created to do the same in social sciences and looks at disciplines like education. So while these organizations were up and running, in 2004, Andrew Pullen and colleagues published this paper in Biological Conservation. And this looked at the way land managers in the United Kingdom use scientific evidence to inform their decision making. And what the study found was that conservation actions remain experience-based and rely heavily on traditional management practices. So managers were not making full or systematic use of the available evidence to inform their decisions. And I'm just going to pause to say that if you think maybe that's unique to the United Kingdom or to land managers, it's not. So it was found the same thing in 2016 here in Canada by Nathan Young at Ottawa U. Some of our team and our colleagues at UBC found that fisheries managers from DFO and Pacific salmon stakeholders in British Columbia reported that they used personal contact as the primary source of science-based information. So in other words, they were using cross-cubicle communication or going to their colleagues for advice to inform their decision-making. So this initial study led to the publication of this opinion piece by Bill Sutherland, Andrew Pullen, Paul Dolman, and Terry Knight. And that's really what kickstarted this environmental evidence movement. So in 2006, the concept that Campbell and Cochrane had been using for years was translated into environmental science, and the the collaboration for environmental evidence was launched by Andrew Pullen. So what is the collaboration for environmental evidence? Or from here on out, I'll just refer to it as CEE. So it's a global collaboration made up of scientists, policymakers, environmental managers, and stakeholders. It's a not-for-profit. It has formal charitable status in the United Kingdom, and they provide guidelines for high standards of independence and rigor and supports the preparation, maintenance, promotion, and dissemination of evidence syntheses. So as I mentioned from the beginning, there are 8 official CEE centers around the globe. We are home to the Canadian Centre here in Ottawa, and each center operates independently. They receive their own funds, and they contribute to the work that CEE does by encouraging evidence-based practice and systematic review activity within their geographic region. So no matter where in the world you are, you can reach out to a center that might be a little bit more local to help guide syntheses and evidence-based decision-making. The CEE also has their own journal, Environmental Evidence. This is fully open access and available freely to anyone online. And this is where they publish the CEE evidence syntheses, methods papers, and then commentaries as well. One of the main resources that CEE provides is the guidelines for conducting evidence syntheses, which are freely available on their website. And these guidelines are a living document and are updated as changes in best practices occur or new methodologies are introduced. So if you're looking to conduct an evidence synthesis, this is your starting point, and we'll take you through step by step in great detail. So what is evidence synthesis and why do we do it? So evidence synthesis can be defined as the process of identifying, compiling, combining relevant knowledge from multiple sources so it is readily available for decision makers. As the number of articles published every year continues to grow exponentially, we need reviews to provide summaries of all of this evidence. However, forms of evidence synthesis are not created equal, and each of them come with their own limitations and benefits. So this table outlines a few different review types that you may or may not be familiar with, starting with traditional literature reviews, all the way down to a systematic review. So systematic reviews are considered the gold standard in evidence reviews because they're transparent, objective, repeatable, updatable, robust to criticism, and strive to minimize bias. They also include gray literature, which are reports or papers that are published outside of traditional academic journals, include things like government reports, consultant reports. So they're also the most comprehensive. But the component that really sets them apart from other forms of evidence synthesis is this critical appraisal step. So this is what Steve alluded to in his talk. So every piece of evidence that is included in a systematic review undergoes an evaluation of study validity. So we look at things like study design, level of replication, site, sample selection, possible confounding factors to make sure that we are weighting the evidence that ends up in the analysis properly so we can weed out poor quality studies or downgrade them in the analysis so they don't hold as much weight as properly conducted studies. And as Steve mentioned, in environmental science, sometimes that can be really difficult. There's not many perfect studies out there, just given the factors that we have to deal with in environmental science, but this gives us a way to critically appraise all of these papers before they end up in the analysis. So another form of gold standard evidence synthesis I'd like to introduce you to is a systematic map. So a systematic map is more appropriate when a decision maker has a broader question involving many interventions and outcomes. So a systematic map collects, organizes, and describes the evidence on a broad scale without attempting to synthesize the data. It asks how much and what type of evidence exists rather than what the evidence is trying to tell us. And it can identify gaps in evidence base if there's sufficient evidence to produce a systematic review or conduct a full synthesis. So what are some of the things that we can learn from systematic reviews and maps? I'll go through a few quick examples from our center syntheses to show how they can tell us what the evidence landscape looks like, what knowledge gaps and clusters exist, and how we can assess the impact or effectiveness of a given intervention. So keep in mind, the examples I'm about to show you are just a small piece of the puzzle, and each of them could be an entire presentation on their own. So if you have any specific follow-up questions on the results, I'm happy to send you or point you to the publication, chat later, or connect you with a project lead for any of the nitty-gritty science details. So let's start with how the evidence syntheses can show us what the evidence landscape looks like. So in 2019, we published the protocol for a systematic map looking at the evidence on the effectiveness of conservation-oriented captive breeding and release programs. And this full systematic map is now submitted for review. After screening through thousands of articles, this systematic map includes 460 articles and 524 studies. So when looking at the studies included in the map or review, one thing we can describe is the location that these studies occur. So for example, when we visualize it as an actual map, we can see the studies that in this case, where most of them related to captive breeding of fish, came from the USA, Canada, and Australia, with a few others scattered through South America, Russia, Europe, Asia. So that's for fishes. When we look at mussels, the majority of the studies were actually conducted in the USA, the United Kingdom, and the Czech Republic. So for the sake of time, these next few slides, I'm just going to focus on studies related to fishes only and not mussels. So when looking at our evidence base, we can also describe what the population looks like. In this case, we have it broken down here into family and genera. And that will tell us that the studies included in the systematic map were made up mostly of Salmonidae and Accipentridae. And we can break this down even further at the species level if the data allows. We can also look at the type of study designs that authors are using to study their work. So Backy designs before, after. So all of this tells us how many studies used controls or not. And we can also look at the outcomes measured. So in this case, most of the data on fishes was related to genetic diversity, growth, and survival metrics. So it can also tell us what knowledge clusters and gaps exist. For this, I'm going to use an example of our recently published systematic map on the effects of flow regime changes on fish productivity. Given the breadth of this question, we ended up including 1,199 articles and 1,368 studies. So by far our largest evidence synthesis to date. And one thing that systematic maps are particularly good for are creating these heat maps. So heat maps are a great way to visually see the distribution of evidence and identify those knowledge clusters and gaps. So looking at this one, it might get complicated quick, but I'll focus in on the areas that really matter. So here we're plotting the number of studies for a given outcome in relation to a linkage with the flow regime changes. So these are grouped down on the side by the cause of such change. So we have things like hydro dams, we have dams without hydro, we have water extraction, natural changes. And now looking at this matrix of counts, the darker colored cells are going to indicate higher frequency of occurrences of evidence, while lighter colors will show lower or no evidence at all. So let's zoom in on one area here. So we're going to look closely at changes in flow regime due to hydroelectric production. And what we can see here is that we can identify knowledge clusters in the circles there on papers reporting fish abundance, diversity, richness, migration, and growth for those hydro-related causes of flow regime change. Looking at another area, so these natural changes in flow regime, so think about things like droughts and floods, climate change. We can see clusters of evidence reporting fish abundance, diversity, richness, growth, community structure, recruitment, and migrating fish abundance. So these heat maps can also help us visually identify gaps in the literature. So looking at this figure, we know that more comprehensive evidence is needed to understand how fish productivity metrics are affected by changes in flow regime due to things like restoration, land use change, water withdrawal, and diversion activities. And this type of information can help guide future primary research to answer those questions. So in collaboration with Fisheries and Oceans Canada, our centre has already taken steps to dive deeper into some of these identified knowledge clusters. And now we're conducting 2 follow-up systematic reviews. So the first on how do changes in flow magnitude due to hydroelectric power production affect fish abundance? And then again, that same question, but related to those natural and climate-induced changes in flow regime. So lastly, when there's sufficient data, we can ask evidence syntheses to assess the impact or effectiveness of an intervention. This example will draw from a recent systematic review conducted by our centre on the relative risks of mortality and injury for fish during downstream passage at hydroelectric dams. This review included 222 studies from 87 relevant articles. The primary question in this review was, what are the consequences of fish entrainment and impingement with hydroelectric dams on freshwater fish in temperate regions? So although the evidence base didn't allow for a full evaluation of the consequences of entrainment and impingement per se, we were able to evaluate the risk of freshwater fish injury and mortality owing to downstream passage through common hydropower infrastructure. And what this was able to tell us is that there's an estimated 215% increase in risk of fish injuries with passage through or over hydro infrastructure and over and above the control group. And an estimated 235% increase in immediate mortality risk over and above the control group. So taken together, these results suggest that overall hydropower infrastructure increase the overall risk of freshwater fish injury and immediate mortality in temperate regions. Now, the secondary question in this review asked to what extent factors like site or intervention type influence the impact of fish entrainment or impingement. And we had sufficient data to examine how the different infrastructure types influence the risk of fish injury and immediate mortality. So injury risk varied among infrastructure types, with spillways and turbines associated with higher risk ratios than general infrastructure and water bypasses. And immediate mortality risk varied among infrastructure types also, so with general infrastructure, turbines, and sluiceways associated with higher risk ratios than spillways and water bypasses, and with stronger effects for general infrastructure and turbines. So some of the take-home messages from this review, this synthesis of available evidence suggested that hydropower infrastructure in temperate regions increased, on average, the overall risk of fish injury and immediate mortality, so immediate mortality being less than 1 hour after they enter the tail race. Turbines and spillways increase the risk and/or mortality for downstream passing fish compared to the controls. And bypasses are the most fish-friendly passage option in terms of reducing fish injury and mortality. So as challenges and threats to freshwater ecosystems continue to arise and intensify, we need to make environmental decisions based on the best available evidence. And this is so we can conserve valuable time and resources, learn from past experiences, minimize the risk of getting it wrong, especially in cases where there's a lot of money involved, maybe there's species at risk involved. We need to make those decisions properly. And we need to make decisions that are defensible, especially when the issue is controversial. So whether you're an evidence user or generator, there are steps you can take now to help support evidence-based decision-making. If you are in the position to make decisions, choose the most reliable, transparent, and comprehensive evidence synthesis available. You can do this by visiting the CE library on their website to see what systematic reviews and maps exist already. You can also visit the new freely available CE Database of Evidence Reviews, or CEDR, and I have the link here and can send it to you as well. And this includes a database of traditional literature reviews, so non-systematic, that might not be up to gold standard, but they're independently scored for their reliability. So you can go find a review on your topic of interest and then see how much confidence you can put into the results of that review. Currently, there's over 700 articles in that database, and it's growing on a weekly, monthly basis as new articles are published. If an evidence synthesis on your topic of interest doesn't exist, you can look to conduct or commission one with support from our center or the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence. And then we can help you to choose the right approach. So if it's a systematic map, you're looking at a broad question that describes the evidence landscape, identifies knowledge gaps and clusters, and is often used as a starting point, like we did in the flow regime map, or a systematic review, which looks at a narrow question related to the impact or effectiveness of an intervention, and can sometimes include a quantitative analysis when the data allows. If you are an evidence generator, make an effort to conduct high quality research that includes proper controls and that we can include in future evidence syntheses, and then make that research accessible to those synthesizing it. And advocating within your network, your organization, and your government for evidence-based decision-making is something that everyone can do right now. Thank you.
Matt, you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry, thank you very much, Jessica, for that. And we have time for maybe a quick question. Maybe I could lead it off just by saying that I think that's amazing work that's happening there at the center. Is the synthesizing of all those evidence, all that evidence from as you said, in some cases over 1,000 publications on a single question or topic is such a powerful thing. And also how the center has now made all of these evidence-based reviews available to the public and anyone else that wants to have access to that, those types of reviews. I think it's great. Is there evidence that government agencies are using these syntheses to direct policy?
Yeah, so we've worked really closely with government agencies over the past few years. DFO in particular, we started with them working closely about 4 years ago, and they have commissioned the majority of our Canadian reviews. And we've definitely seen a shift over the years in, a small group of people who had interest and faith in these things, and now our network of collaborators is growing. So a couple years ago, we conducted a systematic review on habitat creation as an offset means. And during the conduct of that review, we had a lot of DFO partners involved, and it eventually led to being a piece of evidence used in their CSAS process, which is an internal peer review process that DFO uses to provide science advice. So one of our systematic reviews, plus another document that we created related to the same project, were used as key pieces of science advice in their internal processes. So it's taking time, but we're definitely seeing it. Now we have projects with Environment Canada, Parks Canada, Fisheries and Oceans Canada. They're definitely starting to gain interest in these. We conducted a survey last year of about 80 scientists, policymakers in high levels of government and NGOs. And what they were saying is that they don't need to be convinced of the merit of these systematic reviews. We need more of them. We need them to become adopted into their processes, which can take time. But yeah, we're definitely seeing, especially in Canada, an increase in their uptake.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you. So if anyone has further questions for Jessica, I invite you to contact her. Her contact information is on our website and our program for the symposium as well. So thank you very much for sharing the work that you do, Jessica.
Thanks, Matt.